But he points out that, let's go through these points here. I do want to read most of these. First one, people want freedom to make decisions that affect themselves, don't want to be bullied. But that requires a community in which everyone recognises each other's free will and the right for all to exercise their free will. In turn, that means that the community which we live in must realise the universe's own objective requirements for morality, specifically that knowingly exercising your free will in such a way that it encroaches on someone else's ability to do the same causes you to commit a crime under natural law. Any other behaviour is right behaviour, as decided. So, under natural law, the laws that exist in nature, we all come into the world and we all have a natural right to sustain our life and to try to improve the condition of it if we can. And we're perfectly at liberty to do that, as long as we don't do it by harming other people. The fifth one down there, committing these crimes has consequences for us, are delivered back to us through the natural unfolding of events or the organic playing out of dynamics within the universe. This is the delivering back to us or mirroring our stuff. Right? Some people would refer to that as the law of karma. There's all sorts of names for it, but what we do, it tends to come back towards us. Let's move on. He says here in point 6, a community that recognises all of this is a community that functions under the ideology of individualism and recognises individual rights. It's fundamentally non-collectivist. Collectivism is dangerous because it's groupthink. We have been led or been programmed to believe concepts like for the greater good, or the needs of the majority must always override the minority. This is dangerous and fundamentally anti-universe. And if you find yourself using these phrases, we can trick. And that's a principle that's opposed to the principle of individual freedom, that everybody should be free. If you start saying, well, but in some things, you know, where people can't agree about what should be the law, we better go for the greater good for the greatest number. That's contradicting the natural law, and it won't ever lead to a harmonious society. Voting in elections is violence on the minority or the individual. Like that? Okay, I'm getting it. Okay. When we vote in an election, you're expecting, if your opinion is the same as the majority, that what you want will override the other's opinion through sheer brute force of numbers. What the majority wants, though, is not necessarily correct. And the universe fundamentally doesn't operate like that, because it would be the will of the majority denying the free will of the minority, or even the individual. So he goes on here to say, the English Constitution, is it compatible with everything described above? And the answer is yes, because all it's doing is defending the people against an administration becoming something more, a government. Under a common law constitution, the government isn't really a government at all. Why? Because under a common law constitution, it's the people that do the governing of themselves, not officers or officials. The government is nothing more than an administration executing the wishes of the people. And it sounds like anarchy, doesn't sound a bit anarchic. But we'll move on, we'll come through a couple of other illustrations. So justice is created through the consciousness of the jurors, because the people, through the jury, are the final arbiter of law. And specifically, in each individual situation, the individual defendant is afforded justice by examining intent and context. The jury are an authority over government legislation and can pass verdicts that are in opposition to legislation. This is known as a annulment by jury. Now, most people have no idea that that power of annulment by jury exists even today in the very few jury trials that take place. And on William Keats' website, commonlawconstitution.org, there's an excellent movie. It's about an hour long, and it was actually filmed, a jury procedure in a trial in the United States. They allowed it to be filmed, What happens when the jurors went into the room? There was a person accused of a breach of legislation, and they were technically guilty of it. But the person had done no harm to anyone. And in the jury room, it turned out that some of them started saying, well, do we really want to send this guy to jail? He hasn't done any harm to anyone. Why are we even here talking about it? And there was a bit of toing and froing. Eventually, 11 of the jurors were determined that, well, really, we really shouldn't be punishing this guy. One guy said, well, no, he's technically guilty, so I think we should. But he said, I can see that every one of the rest of you differs from that. He said, I'm going to go along with you because, it's more likely that 11 of you are right than I'm right. So that was how the jury worked in that situation. In that period, the defence lawyer spoke with the judge in chambers. He said, can I let these people know that they have the power of the number? And the judge said, if we let them know that, that would be anarchy. Who knows what would happen if we let people go by their consciences. So he said, to be fair, he said, if they can work it out for themselves, I'll wear the result, I'll wear the decision. So the defence lawyer wasn't able to let them know. But the outcome was that the jury annulled that piece of legislation. They said, no, we're not going to find this guy guilty. Okay? So the English Constitution actually provides for that. It's compatible with natural law and what the universe permits for us. The English Constitution properly places limitations on government such that it is so that people's individual rights under natural law are protected. Let's move on now. Okay, these are some more important points about trial by jury that people, if they realise, might think, well, if we could get this going, we could solve a lot of the problems in society within a few months. In this case, in trial by jury, a single juror in a case where legislation was annulled would be able to bring a publicly funded court action against legislators who had enacted legislation which caused harm or loss to people in violation of their natural rights. So we were talking about natural law being, we don't do any harm to people, we don't cause loss, we don't commit fraud, we keep the peace. They're the only four things. Everybody agrees to those laws. Right, you don't need to be written down. We know those things from when we're growing up. You never need to read them anywhere, really. There would be no more parliamentary immunity under that system. Politicians would be just as answerable for their actions as everyone else in their community. At the moment, they're immune from accountability, aren't they? The Crown's role in prosecution would be minimal. It probably be limited to cases where the victim was unable to plead, as in a murder case. Obviously, somebody else has got to prosecute the case on behalf of the victim. Professional advocates, like lawyers, would become redundant, as would magistrates and judges employed by one of the interested parties. And surely having a judge or magistrate employed by one of the parties to the case is a flagrant breach of impartiality. Cases would be heard by the jurors, assisted on points of law by elected conveners, well versed in law. The plaintiff and the defendants would be the only ones to address the jurors, apart from the witnesses and/or required experts. Most cases now occurring would simply not materialise, there being no underlying crime. For example, I'm sure most of us have had some situation where we've been done for speeding, or in the front of our bumper went 6 inches over the stop line, and Hawkeye, PC Hawkeye spotted it, went over the summons. Now we could either pay, or we could go to court and contest it. But there in court is a guy that's employed by one of the parties. So what sort of justice is that? It isn't any sort of justice at all, right? It's just it's a racketeering system, basically. Let's move on. Okay, we're going to take a break after this particular slide. Now we're talking here, it's very important to understand the difference between lawful and legal. Most people just confuse the two terms. The average person, maybe not in this room, but the average person out there just doesn't understand the difference. So man-made legislation, acts, statutes and policies are not the law. Natural law is the law. That's the law that everybody agrees to. And there's no argument about it. Let's look at these two things under the headings of morality and freedom. This is quoting from Mark Tassio. He says, when human beings in the aggregate live in harmony with natural law and are therefore moral, they become and remain free. But when human beings in the aggregate live in opposition to natural law and are therefore immoral, they become and remain enslaved. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, we had an example before. If you vote in an election, people vote in elections, they think, well, my wife wanted running things that didn't get in last time, I'm going to vote for them. And if they get in, then we, hopefully some of the policies I want will be imposed upon the people who didn't vote the same as I did. That is immoral. We're seeking to impose our will on other people. And even though we might think it's for, a good purpose, well, who defines what's good? Is that subject to just changing circumstances, or is something that's good or bad always good or bad? That's the point that we need to figure. Now, we carry on here. As aggregate morality increases, aggregate freedom increases. And aggregate morality decreases, aggregate freedom declines. So the more people want, and Marcus Aurelius, the ancient Roman emperor, about 1500 years ago, pointed out, he said, the more laws a society has, the more corrupt it will be. The more things that you want to control other people, the worse things you're going to get. So this fundamental law of natural law we refer to as the law of freedom. And the law of freedom, this is the point I wanted to finish on before while we have this break. It's just as immutable as the physical laws, which dictate that a car engine won't work unless every law pertaining to the constituent parts is complied with. But we can all understand that concept, can't we? But most people find it difficult to apply that same type of understanding to laws involving the interrelationships between people. But they're just as immutable. You can't impose your will on someone and coerce them to do things that are against their will, their conscience, without there being consequences. And the more people engage in that, the worse the consequences are for the community. So I'm going to have a break there and have a couple of whatever. We'll come back and we'll move on, and then eventually after the next session we'll have a question and answer. Thank you very much for your attention so far. Thank you very much.